Okay, I think we'll kick off here. So, welcome everyone to today's webinar on navigating Victoria's child employment laws in the entertainment industry. I'm your moderator today. My name is Callum Flint, and I'm the team leader of child employment licensing in the advisory services team. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the lands I'm speaking from today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, both past, present, and emerging, as well as any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Our presenters today are Claire Sanders, Assistant Director, Advisory Services at the Workforce Inspectorate Victoria, overseeing the child employment licensing function. Katrina Moody, Manager, Youth Pathways and Transitions, Department of Education, and Liesl Egan, Child Safety and Wellbeing Advocate, Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Some housekeeping before we go on. Please note that we cannot provide legal advice, and the content of today's presentation is for educational purposes only. We've had some great questions come in from our audience during registration, and we've tailored some of our content today to provide answers. If any further questions for the presenters arise during the presentation, please type them in the questions box and, time permitting, we'll address them during a Q&A session at the end of the broadcast. This webinar is recorded and will be emailed to you shortly after this broadcast. It will also be available on the WIV website in the coming days. During the webinar, we'll be sharing links in the chat to some of the resources that will be discussed today and other helpful resources that relate to this topic. We'll also share a short feedback survey in the chat for you to complete before you leave the webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time to complete the survey, and your feedback will help us improve our future webinars. So, we'll start the webinar with some discussion on navigating the licensing process. The audience is aware that to employ children under 15 in Victoria, you must have a child employment licence. Claire, can you briefly describe the difference between a general licence and an entertainment licence?
Certainly. Thank you, Callum. Before we delve into the different licence types, it might be helpful to clarify a few definitions under the Child Employment Act. So, as Callum mentioned, the definition of a child under the Child Employment Act means someone under 15 years of age. Children who are already 15, 16 or 17, they're not covered under the Child Employment Act, so employers don't need a licence from the Workforce Inspectorate to engage that age group to work. The definition of employment doesn't just mean a worker being paid to perform a task or work a shift. Under the Act, the definition of employment is deliberately wide, so it extends beyond regular employment contract type of work to make sure that other arrangements involving children in employment-like work are also covered too. So when assessing whether an arrangement between an organisation and a child might be considered employment, it's important to look at who actually benefits from that arrangement and also whether the child is subject to direction about how that work should be undertaken and who is directing that child. So there are two different types of licenses, one for general industries, so things like retail, hospitality, and one for the entertainment industry. So that's things like TV productions, still photography, theatre productions as well. And that's the focus of today's session. So it's important that applicants actually select the right license type when they're applying for a license because entertainment licenses do have slightly different conditions that the employer has to comply with. So things like nominating an employer representative. That's someone who can make day-to-day decisions about the child's work and make sure that any license conditions are met. They have specific responsibilities under the Act, and they do require often a working with children's clearance as well, unless they're exempt. Adhering to the mandatory code of practice for the employment of children in the entertainment industry. That's another condition of entertainment licenses, and we'll cover that in a bit more detail later in this session. Another key difference with employment in the entertainment industry is that there's no minimum age for employment, and also licenses last for 1 year, whereas it's 2 in general industries.
I'd just like to jump in if I can. I often get asked by my colleagues when we're creating factual content whether what we're doing actually constitutes employment and the need to notify the regulator. With scripted, it's quite obvious, they're getting paid, they're playing a role, but when it comes to factual, sometimes you do need to do a little bit of delving. And I'll usually query how much we're directing the children. Are we providing any scripts, any guidance, any direction? Have we set up the scenario and the filming? So an example is if we are recording a song for a use in a program, and we're bringing the children in, we're recording the children who are singing it, it's most likely going to be employment. It's only when the work would be taking place regardless of ABC's involvement that it may not be employment. So this example would be a concert in the park where a children's choir is performing and the ABC have gone along to film the event, like for something like news. If I was filming Voxies with the children who are participating, it still wouldn't fall under that definition of employment. However, if I'm going there to film B-roll and then I want to interview the soprano of the choir and I've pre-arranged this, suddenly I'm moving from non-employment into employment. So that child might be there singing, separate from our, us organizing it, but the interview is something that I've set up that they have to now do on top of their day. So I would then advise going on to lodge that notification, covering our bases, making sure that it is in fact employment.
Thanks, Liesl. Staying with you, the ABC is a current entertainment license holder. Can you tell us a bit about your experience in applying for a license?
Yeah, overall, the process was pretty simple. We applied for a license when the system changed over from the permit system a few years ago. And once we had all of that initial information, we've been able to copy the old data, check for any updates, and then resubmit that upon our yearly application for a new license. The most challenging part was the size of our organisation. We had to determine who our fit and proper person was, and getting all of the details of our board members, which is a very large board as well. So as you can imagine, as I said, we're a large organisation, so it was really important to ensure that all of our information was correct and get that in there. But once we determined that that information was correct, it was actually a really quick turnaround for approval. And a great thing about the Workforce Inspectorate is that they'll give you a 30-day lead-in time when your yearly licence is about to expire. And it'll be like, hey, your licence expiration's coming up. You will need to apply for a new one. So it's a great reminder, and it's actually a really good time frame to start getting all your ducks in a row so you're not having any interruption to work. And one thing I'd like to say about the portal when it comes to lodging that information in Victoria, it's actually able to house all of my previous entries. So I can go back and see who has lodged employment for the ABC, what children we've employed, what the nature of the work was. And this is actually a feature that I can't access in other jurisdictions. So I do really appreciate that feature here in Victoria.
Thanks, Liesl. Claire, a question that was submitted from the audience before this session. Some employers have provided feedback to us that they're suffering from paperwork fatigue, especially relating to productions of 30 or more children. Are there any plans that you can talk to about making this more accessible?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Callum. So we are actively working on an improvement project to make sure that our systems do meet the needs of all of our stakeholders. So this will include looking at improvements on how we users manage bulk data in our system for license holders who do employ large numbers of children, and particularly for those in the entertainment industry who manage several projects, often with large numbers of children. So the solutions we're looking at will hopefully reduce the need for information to be re-entered when it comes to things like employment details and children's details if the employer has already notified us of a child perhaps previously. There has also been some improvements to the general performance of our portal, so that means less timeouts and better speed of processing as well, which has improved things. And it's also worth noting that multiple children can actually be notified at once in the one submission, which does save time. We do see employers sometimes submitting a notification per child, even when the employment details are the same. You can actually group them under the same notification. There's a little button down the bottom saying add another child, which can save a bit of time. But we are always open to feedback and suggestions. We'll be touching base with stakeholders as we progress through any system improvements and very open to feedback in that space.
Oh, thanks, Claire and Liesl. We'll move now into talking about supervision and the safety processes and include some information about school exemption. From that perspective, Claire, can you walk us through what's required of employers of children under 15 and why it's so important?
Yeah, certainly. So I think it's helpful, before we dive into this section, to look at the overarching purpose of the Child Employment Act. So the Act exists to protect children from performing work that could be harmful to their health, their safety, their well-being or development, but also that could prejudice their attendance at school or their capacity to benefit from instruction. So there's several things that employers do need to do to protect kids in the workplace. Now we won't go into detail on each obligation here, but some helpful resources will be posted in the chat. So employers do need to make sure that kids are supervised at all times, including during auditions and casting processes, by someone with working with children clearance or an exemption. So for instance, a parent or guardian supervising their own child would not need a working with children clearance. We have unfortunately all seen some really horrific cases recently that highlight the potential harms that can happen to children through lack of appropriate supervision. So this is really important to make sure that employers get right. Kids also aren't just mini adults in the workplace. They can't do the same work that adults do. Employers have to make sure that they take that into account, making sure that kids can only perform light work and that any potential risks are appropriately mitigated. So we do have some really great resources on this that we'll share in the chat as well after the session. Also, employers have to make sure that the kids only work the hours and are given the rest breaks that they're supposed to. So if there are adjustments needed, we can assess this on a case-by-case basis if there's variations to hours, and we'll cover that in a little bit. But we do have to be satisfied that any different arrangement doesn't adversely impact the child or their schooling. If the arrangement does involve being away from school from a period of time, that's when a school exemption process with the Department of Education kicks in, which Katrina can talk to.
Thanks, Claire. I'm not going to dive straight into that, but I just wanted to, I guess, point out to your point that one of the things we really look at and want recognition for is that working with children does look different because it is different, and therefore there are a lot of supports and requirements, and we know that sometimes paperwork fatigue can be a very real thing. But it's really to ensure that there's protective measures in place to enable these opportunities and that they're fantastic opportunities. We don't want them to be barriers. But when you think about young people across the board, very different needs, and that it would be really daunting being in such an adult dominated environment where everybody knows what they're doing, well, in theory. So ensuring that they've got somebody trusted and to go to is really important. And it should be a really good opportunity as well for a partnership between, you know, the family and the young person, the employer as well, and the school all coming to the table to ensure that it's fantastic for them.
That's a really good point, Katrina. I suppose we'll jump into it now. What does the school exemption look like from the school side or from the view of the Department of Education?
Yeah, thanks, Callum. So when we talk about exemptions, school exemptions for the entertainment industry, it helps to be really clear that this is, you know, a specific and tightly controlled type of exemption. Schooling is compulsory for young people from 6 to 17 years of age, and we need to ensure that that remains a priority for our young people, but we also don't want to get in the way of the fantastic opportunities that sometimes pop up for these young people. So from the school side, the process usually begins when a parent or carer will approach the school with a request. It's often linked to a specific opportunity, for example, a filming schedule or performance commitment. The school will then have to look at what the details of the opportunity are, understand the time commitment and duration, consider the impacts on that young person's learning, and also consider if there's the possibility that this work could occur during outside of school hours, for example. But most importantly, unlike our longer term exemptions, which sometimes pop up, this isn't about a student leaving school altogether. So it's about how do we support this opportunity while keeping the student connected and succeeding in their education. So we don't want to be a barrier, but we also have to be very careful about how we manage this and how the impacts of how long they're out of school and what they're doing can impact them. So we want to ensure that by accessing this, they're supported and they're not then struggling afterwards to catch up with their peers. So the principal is ultimately responsible for assessing the application, and they would consider things like whether it's genuinely short-term and time-limited, what the student's learning needs and progress has been. So for example, if they're really struggling in schooling, then that might be a consideration as to whether they approve the request. And also then how they're going to manage any of the missed learning that's going to occur. So ultimately, the principal's responsible for deciding the outcome, and also they're allowed to stipulate if any tutoring or additional conditions are required as a provision for that opportunity. So this could be things like learning plans, or if the young person has a specifically important assessment or exam coming up, ensuring that they're able to still do that. So it's very balanced. We want the opportunity, but obviously to make sure that it's measured and strongly considered. From a department side of things, we want to ensure that obviously there's appropriate oversight and that we're supporting our young people. We have to ensure that it meets the requirements of Ministerial Order 714, which I assure you is not an exciting read, but our policy page, which hopefully will be shared in the chat, is a great source of information if you've got any questions about what the process looks like. But ultimately, key takeaways is it can't be an open-ended arrangement. They have to be to a specific employer, a specific event, and for a set period of time, and ensuring that we're balancing those needs of amazing opportunity to access this kind of employment and build up their resume, but also not wanting to negatively impact them beyond that.
I'd just like to add, it's really important to be prepared if the school has concerns about the child missing their education, as Katrina's pointed out. There was one time that we wanted to work with a child in Western Australia and take them overseas for a performance. We had a week of pre-trip filming planned and then about 10 days overseas. The parents put in the request and the principal initially said no. And this was something, this was like 10 years ago, we weren't prepared for. We were like, oh, what do we do? And it looked as if we'd have to do all of our pre-trip filming outside of school hours and on weekends to reduce the impact on the child's education. So I encouraged the producer who was on the ground in WA to have a conversation with the principal, the parents and the child to see if some middle ground could be reached. What were the principal's concerns? Why did they initially say no? And the principal was concerned about how much school the child had missed previously outside of our employment of them. So working with them, we put together an educational support plan, and then the principal was happy to grant that exemption. So when we work with schools, we really need to ensure that we're actively working with them. We can't just put in a request the day before we need it and assume it's going to be signed. We have to give them time to communicate what their needs are as well.
Well, yeah, despite the reservations on behalf of the school, that does sound like the ideal result for all parties concerned. To touch on the other end of the spectrum, have you been on any shoots where budget has put stresses on safety standards or where safety has been a concern? How did you handle that and remain compliant?
Yeah, so when you talk about compliance with the regulators, you're talking about child safety. And this is just something that you can't compromise on regardless of budget size. So when I worked in low budget children's television, our focus was children. We put them at the center of things. And once you've done that, all of your compliance will naturally fit into place. It's when we don't center children that we can see breaches of compliance or unsafe child practices. I was working on a live program once for a different network, and a woman was to be interviewed, filmed live, and she arrived and she'd brought her baby to set. And again, this was like 10, 12 years ago. And given the nature of live filming, the senior producer at the time said that she could give her interview with her child in her arms on camera. And this was actually a breach. There was no knowledge of what the baby had done in the lead up to the work with us that day. That mother may have been doing interview rounds, doing the press circuit, and that baby could have been tagging along with her. This could have been that baby's fourth consecutive hour of filming for all we knew. And a recurring issue that I see is that the budget may not include supervision, effective supervision of children. So this is something to be really mindful of, particularly in low budget shoots. A child supervisor should have no other role or responsibility on the day. It can't just be a PA who has 100 other things to do. The supervisor is there to ensure the child's best interests. So if a parent is involved in the filming with the child, if they're going to be on camera as well, how can that parent effectively supervise their child in the moment if they're thinking about their own responses, their own performance? So in the case of the baby in the interview, ideally that person would have brought along another adult, their partner, or a family member to mind the baby while she took part in the interview. Or the production should have had someone with a working with children check step in to look after that baby. Because if you center the child, you're suddenly asking questions about how the production can change to fit the needs of the child rather than the other way around.
Yeah. Did you want to talk about how you've integrated team members into productions?
Integrated team members into productions in regards to being supervisors?
A bit about supervisors and just the time spent, but if not, we can move forward.
No, absolutely. So when we have ABC people being the supervisors of children, they are required to have their Victorian working with children check. And so often they will be a member of our team, but what we do is that we schedule their entire day to be the supervisor for that child. So they're not required to, run off and take a meeting, take a phone call. And that's something we sometimes see as well when we bring in family members, parents to supervise their child. They might be like, oh yeah, it's like a work from home day. I'm just going to take a work call. And it's like, well, no, unfortunately, you are here to be the supervisor of the child. So that is your role for today. And when we have multiple children, obviously multiple parents coming in is not ideal. We don't want 10 children, 10 sets of parents coming in. So that's when we'll often look at a staff member being the supervisor for the children that day and then have effective ratios of one adult to, 6, 8 or 10 children, depending on the age range and needs.
Yeah, wow. Thanks for the extra context there. That's really good. We'll move now into the third segment of our webinar and discuss implementing the mandatory code. So in addition to the Child Employment Act, employers with entertainment licenses must also abide by the mandatory code of practice for the employment of children in entertainment, which is a ministerial order that contains additional provisions specific to the employment of children in the entertainment sector. Claire, can you talk a bit about which parts of the mandatory code we as the regulator would most want employers to be aware of, whether they're new or highly experienced?
Certainly, thanks, Callum. So we know that work in the entertainment industry can be quite complex. There's lots of logistics involved. Liesel's provided some examples of some of the thinking that has to go on with large productions. And things don't always go to plan in entertainment as well. I'm sure you all know that. So it is important that license holders are across when the work might not align with hours or the pattern of work that the mandatory code stipulates, and when they might need to request a variation to the mandatory code. So we do tend to get quite large and complex requests to vary the mandatory code quite late in the piece for productions, because license holders haven't turned their mind to the impact of certain schedules or unexpected events on the child that they're actually employing. So again, like Liesl said, it's not centering the child in that production. So it is important that license holders think ahead and try and account for things like, technical issues that could delay the start time of a show, or, the arrival time of a child versus when they're, required to be on stage, or, travel time between different locations, those things that may mean that a child's actually working longer hours than the code stipulates, and therefore the employer might need to look at a variation request. So for us at the Workforce Inspectorate, assessing these requests, it isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, particularly when children in the entertainment industry, they can vary from babies through to 14-year-olds. So we do need to assess those variation requests on a case-by-case basis, and be satisfied that the health, education, welfare of the child won't suffer because of that new arrangement. It's also really important for licence holders to be aware of what's prohibited conduct under the Act and the Code, and the employer has to take reasonable steps to prevent prohibited conduct. So that includes any behaviour that might socially isolate the child, intimidate, threaten, frighten or humiliate them. That's prohibited conduct. Any actions that may make the child distressed for the purposes of eliciting an emotional reaction, for example, for a TV show, that's prohibited conduct, or exposing a child to inappropriate adult themes. So things like nudity, sex, violence, drug use, that's prohibited conduct as well. Now, that doesn't mean that children can't work on productions that may contain those themes, but it must be carefully coordinated with the child's safety and well-being front of mind, and appropriate, obviously, for the age and development of the child as well.
Yeah, and it's important to understand how age and appropriate content or themes can impact a child's well-being. So we need to ask, are they aware of what they're portraying, saying, doing, and what will it mean to have that content out in the real world and in the digital space? And we really need to start thinking about the separation of the child actor versus the child character. Just because a child character is in a particular scene and acting a certain way, we still have to be protecting the child actor. So this might mean that you need to prepare the child, you need to talk to them about what the content's going to be like, minimize the risk of harm or trauma to them by limiting their interaction with certain production elements, include their parents and guardians and the regulator in the discussion about how you're going to do this. So if you're submitting a notification, you're submitting things like, you know, the script, the child version of the script, how you're going to protect the child around scene 2B, all of that sort of stuff. So for scripted content, I've had to advise things like a child version of the script where we've removed all of the swearing, things that weren't relevant to their performance. We've advised breaking down a fight scene or breaking down injury makeup and let the child see those things before they come into the set, into the scene. And even shoot the child in reversals, separate the child actor from the action in the scene. But then when you've cobbled it together later on, it appears that the child character is present within that scene. For factual content, when the themes have been quite mature or the child is talking about a personal situation, which, you know, can sometimes involve trauma, mental health needs, things like that. Sometimes something like a psychological assessment's required. And I always make sure that we're chasing informed consent. So does that child and their family understand that their story is going to be out there on our platform and in the social space? I also encourage a follow-up once the content has aired, because sometimes telling our personal stories, seeing them played back to us can be quite confronting as well, understanding now, oh, this is real, this is out there. So it's not about watering down the content of the script or the record, but rather looking at how those themes can affect a child and how we're going to, you know, work around that and protect the child actor or child participant.
I just want to jump in there if I can, because that's a really good point, Liesl. And I think one of the things we need to really understand and acknowledge is that the understanding and willingness of a young person can vary quite significantly, not only to their peers, but also to what maybe the parent has or can consent to. And this can go in both directions. Sometimes the parent may overcommit to something that the child's not comfortable with, or it can be that the child has and the parent's not comfortable with that. So understanding how that may impact and how to have that conversation is really important, and ensure that I think the young person especially is aware of what the actual content is, how it can be used, and especially how that may or may not impact them in their social settings, where we know we've got an awful lot of social media now, and all of their peers will be on it and straight on to them about it.
Yeah, that's a really important thing for employers and parents and children to all be aware of. From the employer side, Liesl, how have you handled like booking or appropriately notifying the Workforce Inspectorate of children that are working when often you're in a scenario where call sheets are not finalized until like less than 48 hours pre-shoot?
Yeah, absolutely. Television schedules, super fun. So the Workforce Inspectorate, the great thing is that because we've moved away from that old permit system, we no longer require a certain time period in order to lodge a notification with them. This has saved us so much time at our end because it used to be 3 days and then it was extended to 5 days. New South Wales has 7 days, just as a point of interest. But with the Workforce Inspectorate, we can lodge it as late of the morning of the work if necessary. In these instances where I've got just little time, I'll often pre-email the Workforce Inspectorate and be like, hey, heads up, I've got some work coming up next Monday, the 27th. Unfortunately, I'm not going to get the details of the children until the day of, so we'll be lodging them immediately after the employment or something like that, just so they can keep an eye out for it and be like, oh yeah, cool. That work has already happened. You know, they're looking at it with that lens rather than it's work that's coming up. And that's usually when the children haven't been locked in or they're having some issues with the forms, getting those back. We've got to remember not everyone has printers at home. You know, they might only have a phone rather than a home computer. So you know, being mindful of that around the accessibility of the form. Some people just need a few more days. They won't turn it around for you in their lunch break, like I expect everyone to do. And it's really important as well that even though they've got that stipulation, we're always working to do this and lodge this as early as possible because we need to give the parents time to understand those forms and understand the work that we're asking the children to do. In a bigger production where roles have been cast, obviously there's a lot more lead-in time, there's auditions, there's all of rehearsals, things like that. That date is looming for them from a really long time away. So it's a bit easier. But when we're in the factual world, when we've got a record coming up tomorrow that, you know, we're just organising this afternoon, a child's fallen sick, we need to find someone else, it's a little bit more crazy. So that's why when we're providing those forms, we're explaining to them, this is a child information form. You use this form to tell us of any additional needs that your child has that we can accommodate as their employer. And this is the parental consent form, which outlines the work we're going to do with the child. It will tell you what day, description of the work. It will give you all of that information. So when we've got that short turnaround time, just really stressing to the parents why we're getting those forms, why we need them before the work starts, and then giving the Workforce Inspectorate that heads up that we'll be lodging a little bit late or the day of.
So I'll just jump in there. Thank you for bringing up the forms. It's another thing that we're looking at revamping a little bit to make sure that they're, you know, easy to use for parents to fill in. Just on notifications, you know, since we've moved from a permits to a licensing system, it is, you know, hopefully a lot easier for license holders, you know, instead of having to put in a permit for every instance of employment, you know, employers just have to notify us. So notifications can actually be submitted to us at any time before the expiry of the license. So if you have forgotten to submit a notification prior to the work taking place, that's perfectly okay. You know, parental consent and child information forms, of course, have to be completed before the employment, but the notification can be lodged afterwards. But I will say, submitting notifications ahead of time is still recommended. We do review notifications at the Workforce Inspectorate, so we can often flag with the employer before the work has even taken place, you know, that they may need a variation request because the hours they've stipulated, you know, may actually not be in line with the mandatory code for the entertainment industry, or, you know, flagging if the upcoming employment, you know, may not be appropriate, maybe you know, that they may be in breach of the Act. So submitting the notification ahead of time, you know, it safeguards the child and also safeguards the employer as well.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Speaking of timeframes, Katrina, how long should employers allow for principals to assess school exemption requests?
Yeah, thanks, Callum. And I guess it's a bit of a trick question because the responsibility actually sits with the principal, not the employer, in terms of the decisions being made. So for these exemptions, the decision does lie with the principal. And so in theory, they can be a shorter lead-in timeframe, Technically, the policy requires a principal decision to be in writing to the student and parents within 7 days of the application being received. So we really like, if there's questions or concerns or complexities, for that to be flagged in advance as well. Early notification, we love it. So the principal's consideration time can vary depending on obviously the duration of the employment opportunity, the impacts on their learning or needs, and also the complexity of the student themselves. So some examples would be a principal can put in the expectation that for a period of employment over 3 days, there has to be an absence learning plan. So the school will have to work to ensure that for the 3 days or more, that there is a plan in place of what work they're going to miss and how they're going to still progress in that alongside their peers. Where the duration is over 9 days, the code actually requires the employer to provide daily tutoring. I can get into that a bit later, but that would be for the remainder of the work duration. So that also requires quite a bit of planning from the school end about, again, what would that work look like? How do we work with the tutor in developing a plan for that young person? And on rare occasions, the school principal can also stipulate that additional tutoring requirements may be expected as a condition of their acceptance. And realistically, that would probably happen around if you've got a senior secondary student who's leading into, VCE exams, for example, then we really want to make sure that any gap in their education is covered as well as possible. So whilst these tasks in themselves may not be extensive from an outsider's perspective, when you take into consideration teacher workloads and school staff in general workloads, they can add up quite a bit. So we definitely say a greater lead-in time is recommended. And then, as Liesl pointed out before, there are rare occasions where a principal will actually say no. So ultimately that is their right to do so, but any application that's receives a no response, that then has to be submitted to the Department of Education for our regional director to review and kind of have the final say as to, are we willing to override that decision, which would be rare because normally the principals know the students very well. But that in itself can take some extra time as well. So whilst we have a time frame, it doesn't really incorporate all the planning that necessarily goes into these opportunities as well around the approval process.
Okay, thank you for that, Katrina. We've reached the end of the core questions that we had. So we have, as I mentioned, had some questions from the audience during registration, and some more have come through just during the course of the panel. And I'd like to put them to our panelists. If you have any other questions that have arisen, please put them in the chat now or the questions box. Or if you wish to, you can head to the Workforce Inspectorate's webpage and submit an online inquiry there. I'll stay with Katrina here because you mentioned tutoring requirements. So a question that came in was, do tutoring requirements after 9 days of missed school reset every school term? And as a follow-up, if children have been tutored during the school holidays, can those hours of tutoring be banked and applied to days of work during the school term?
Yeah, this is a big one. So tutoring requirements, we get quite a few questions, both from the school end and also from potential employers and families. So this is a good opportunity to try and clarify some of those. So the tutoring requirements are for the duration of the opportunity with the same employer. So there's obviously some common sense there. If it's over 9 days, then and they're spread over a 6-month period, then there's probably, some negotiation that can take place there. But if they're consecutive days, then absolutely we would want to ensure that there is the requirements for tutoring being met. So I guess things to consider would be that the expectation doesn't reset following school holidays or curriculum days. And that there are quite a lot of requirements about the tutoring component themselves. So I pointed out earlier about our policy page, which Emma has very thankfully put in the chat for you, which goes into a lot more detail about not only our requirements, but also the codes requirements. But some of the key ones to note are that if the principal requires tutoring as a condition of the exemption, then the employer must engage a tutor, and the tutor has to be a registered teacher. So it can't just be somebody that you've sourced, I don't want to say out on the street, but through Facebook as a tutor. Have to be a registered teacher, and not only that, but they actually have to be able to deliver that education based on the student's age and their education level. And if the principal doesn't actually stipulate any additional tutoring requirements, then the code does set the mandatory minimum requirements for that. So once a student has missed the equivalent of 9 school days with the same employer, then the employer engages a tutor. The tutoring has to be for a minimum of 2 hours each school day for the rest of the employment. Or you can average it out to about 10 hours per week over a 4-week period. So the employer has to ensure that that tutor actually has appropriate time to consult with the student's school, to regularly communicate with the school, to develop an education plan that's tailored for that young person. So there's often a lot of time considerations that need to be put in place around enabling that. So you want that lead-in time to really plan that out and have that connection and communication, and enable that person to report back to the school as well. And just to probably clarify, tutoring can't be banked. It's not a do it ahead of time and it counts across the board. But also, having said that, it's not expected to be done during school holidays or weekends, or if the work takes place after hours. It's just for the school days.
Oh, thanks, Katrina. It's a really good clarification. We've had another one that's come through from the audience that you may be able to answer, but maybe not. There's a question about the school exemption form, and we've been asked, is there a way that we could look at, or that maybe the department could look at making a more user-friendly form for parents and schools to complete? Oh.
So we're doing a lot of work at the moment across the exemption space more broadly around updating our policies and also our forms. I will say that exemptions to the entertainment industry aren't the focus at the moment, but they are absolutely on the list. So we will be reworking that form and hopefully lining it up and making it digital like we're trying to do with the other types of exemption forms.
That's really good, thanks. We've had a couple of different questions about whether or not a particular period of entertainment should apply for a license. So we might start there and then go into a bit more detail, but one for Claire, how can a member of the public confirm if they're required to apply for a license? A couple of examples is an extracurricular theatre company. Children pay to be members and put on productions a couple of times a year. Other examples is family influencers or creators, and how would they know that they need to apply for a license?
Yeah, look, it goes back to right at the start, talking about the different definitions under the Act. So as I mentioned, the definitions of employment is deliberately wide to try and capture some different arrangements that may actually be employment. So, emerging industries, things like influencers, that's an emerging industry, may not be classic, when we think about work, an employment type relationship, we may not instantly think of things like influencers. So it's going back to when we assess whether an organisation and a child, the arrangement might be employment, who benefits from the arrangement? Is it for the benefit of, maybe the influencer works as part of a company? It could be for the theatre production. Maybe there's ticketed events, and it's for the benefit of the the company that puts on the performance. Is the child being directed to perform that work a particular way, or who is directing the child to perform work a particular way? There are also some family business exemptions as well that exist under the Act. There's still obligations under the Act for certain things that even family businesses have to abide by. However, they may not require a license. So it's looking a bit more holistically at what's actually being asked of the child. So it has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. It can't only be one type of employment means a license. One thing I will say though, a child employment license is free. So if you were unsure, it's best to apply for a license, give us as much detail as you can about the possible arrangement that you're thinking about, and then we can actually help assess that as well. Legal.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the influencer discussion. It's very niche as well. So apologies if this doesn't apply to everyone attending today. But often as a broadcaster, we have worked with some influencers, some child influencers, and they have created content that has sat alongside other content. But technically, they are working for us in that moment of creating content. And often we've had to say to the parent, this is the mandatory code. Your child cannot work more than these hours. How does this fit in with their schooling? It's a really big discussion with them about how they're going to remain compliant with the code. So it is an area where they definitely need more education, parents and child influencers, to understand that what they're doing is actually moving into the realm of work, regardless of payment and things like that. And knowing sort of how they produce their content, and they do it all in one batch, and then they spend months editing that content and then dropping it and things like that. All of that is the work, all of that is the lead up, all of that's the follow on. So it is discussions that we're having as well, because we don't have this sort of legislation around that. We're trying to make it fit to this new emerging area. So yeah, it's very interesting. So it's an absolute watch this space for us as well.
Yeah, and again, it's looking at who benefits. Potentially there's some arrangements where you as the ABC benefit from that employment that the child's performing. Therefore, potentially could be the employer.
Yeah, yeah. And just going to circle back to what Claire started with. We always are going to recommend, if you have any doubts at all, please apply for a license. It's the best way of us assessing the work because we have everything in writing and we can ask clarifying questions that are relevant to exactly what you're doing. They're free, so please get in touch with us that way. Talk to us about what you're doing. If you don't need a license, we will specify, we'll talk you through. We'll say, it looks like this doesn't need a license. Do you still want to go ahead with it? But it's the best way of having that conversation with us. We've got a couple of questions about supervision. So I'm just having a quick review of the questions that have come through because as an audience, you guys are amazingly active. So we have a question about where companies are asking child supervisors to take on additional duties without additional help. Is that something that the Workforce Inspectorate would like to hear about? And adding on to that, how would we, the Inspectorate, look at stopping both large and small productions from using a body on set with another job being recorded as a supervisor? Claire, is that something you feel like you can talk to? Or Liesl, is that something you have any experience with?
I'm happy to jump in quickly, but I think this is possibly more of a Claire question. Yeah, it is really challenging. I have been that person. I've been that person organising supervisors. I've said to parents, could you put your laptop away, please? You are looking after the children today. It is something that, when it comes to this sort of thing, it is educating the managers. It is educating the production executives, the people at the tops of these productions. So that might be a future, Workforce Inspectorate session for them, understanding that it is a risk for people to have multiple roles. And so I always come back to risk. I'm like, look, I'm sorry, but if you've got someone stepping out who's on radio, taking a meeting, escorting people over there when really they're supposed to be sitting here with the child in between takes, there is the chance that child could wander off. There is a child become lost, become injured in a space like the ABC, which is very big, wander into a section and see some, horrific vision that someone is editing and things like that. So I always pull it back to risk when I'm trying to make people understand that there is a very strong risk here if we do not have a dedicated supervisor. And it might be that, like, it is that the supervisors are understanding that they can say no. And I know that that comes with the manager needs to support that. If someone's like, hey, can you do this on the day? It's just like, I'm actually the child supervisor today. I'm unable to do that. You'll need to find someone else where I can do that once the children have left set. But I think it might be something, whether the workforce inspector, I know that they've got their record of supervisors. So when someone is supervising a child, we should be writing down who that supervisor is, what their working with children check clearance is, or whether they're exempt if they're a parent or they're a teacher, they've got their VIT. So when they do an audit, if something has gone wrong, they're coming back going, who is the supervisor here? And that is also something that they can discipline employers with, saying, well, what happened here? Tell us about your supervision requirements at the time. But yeah, I'm now rambling. Over to Claire.
No, love the insights, Liesl. We do conduct audits and campaigns targeting particular areas. So that is something to note. We are out and about and visiting employers. So you don't want to have a lack of supervision, appropriate supervision for a child on set, and then we pop up and we ask some questions. We can also, as Liesl said, request the supervision logs of who's actually been supervising a child and look at things that way. I think there was a question in there as well about should we report certain things? Absolutely. If there's anything that doesn't feel quite right, even if you're just, as a customer in a business, as an example, if there's something that doesn't seem quite right, or if you think, there's child safe standards that haven't been appropriately met, or supervision requirements that haven't been appropriately met, you can report matters to us online. You can even do it anonymously as well. We do receive anonymous tip-offs, so we can also look at any alleged wrongdoing through that way as well. But if you're unsure about requirements, you can give us a call. We're always here to clarify any concerns that employers might have, and help provide you with some certainty for the employment.
Thanks, Claire. I think we maybe have time for one more question, and this is one that's come in earlier about incorporated associations, including community theatre, seeing individual committee members taking on liability for entire productions regarding employing children. So the question here is, if a committee member is not comfortable with taking on this liability, what options are available to them?
Yes, it's a tricky one. So look, employing children under 15 to work, it is a big deal. It has to be taken seriously. So particularly in the entertainment industry, children can be engaged to work, as young as infants, toddlers, primary school age. That's a particularly vulnerable group of employees. So while an organisation might be the licence holder, there's real people or representatives of that employer who are responsible for making sure that the employment of children complies with the licence conditions. So who might be considered an official representative differs depending on the organisation. Typically it's someone with significant decision-making powers within the business, such as an owner, a director, a partner, an executive, and these people are officers under the law. In the entertainment industry, obviously we mentioned employee representatives as well, play a significant role in making sure kids are kept safe. There are certain protections for officers of incorporated associations, but for that one, I'd recommend seeking legal advice. Ultimately, if the employer and the representatives of that employer, if they're not comfortable taking on the responsibilities involved in employing children, they just shouldn't. There are certain obligations and responsibilities being a licence holder and an official representative of the employer as the licence holder that simply have to be met. Yeah, I'd recommend seeking legal advice on particular company structures and who may be considered in your organisation an officer under the law. But yeah, making sure that everyone's comfortable taking on the responsibilities of ensuring safety in the workplace for kids is imperative.
Yeah, so very important. Thanks for that, Claire. Emma's just dropped the link in the chat. If you've had a question for us or you have further questions, please send us an inquiry through our online portal. Otherwise, we're going to start looking at wrapping up. We've covered so much ground today. I'd like to ask our guest panelists for their final thoughts on employment of children in the entertainment sector. Liesl, do you want to go first?
Yeah, happily. Yeah, so I really just want to address like some of the language we can use around this, paperwork fatigue, barrier. What I really want to do is try and flip that emotion on its head. This is something that the process of employment, getting a license, the forms, the supervision, all of that stuff, these are just the logistics that we're putting in place. They're the nuts and bolts, and they can seem a little bit onerous, but I think we have to start thinking about this as we are rigorous around child safety. Victoria is actually one of the few states that has a regulator that can put these processes in place. I mentioned Western Australia before. Western Australia doesn't have any regulator. I could have gone ahead, taken that kid out of school, worked with them for 10 weeks. If the principal had said that was okay, no one would be tapping me on the shoulder about that. But here in Victoria, we have this regulator and they're centred around child safety. So they are the ones that are setting the bar for child safety in Australia and in entertainment. And we can be a part of that. We can continue telling Australian kids stories, but do it in a really safe way. And as I said earlier, if you're centering the child in your work, half the work's already done. All of this compliance stuff will just fall in naturally. So it is a little bit of a mind shift. It is a bit like, okay, we're working with children. We're going into a kids set. This is not an adult set with kids on it. We're going into a kids set today. Everyone's mindful of that. What do we need to be putting in place? So yeah, if we just sort of flip it on its head and come to it with a real sort of positive, rigorous way of doing things, we know that we are being child safe. So yeah, I always applaud, even though sometimes the processes can seem quite a lot, particularly when we start getting into 30 plus children. This is just what we have to do. If I was bringing a dog on set, I'd have to be following the state law in regards to that. This is what we need to be doing to be working with children in Victoria.
Yeah, thanks, Liesl. Katrina?
Thanks, Callum. I agree. There's been a lot of information today, but hopefully it's been really useful for people. I guess my key takeaways would be just a reminder that we want to support these opportunities from Department of Ed perspective, but depending on the young person's circumstances, there may just need to be some additional lead-in time or planning time that's attached to it. So just to be conscious of that and really work closely in a partnership with the school and the family about what that looks like. And also just, I guess, on the flip side, we work really closely with Workforce Inspectorate around the safety of our young people. So if there are any concerns about breaches, like that was spoken about before, whether they're, regardless of what party they're raised with, if it's relating to a school-age student, then the Department of Ed and Workforce Inspectorate work closely together to assess those potential breaches and address any concerns raised. So it's definitely a partnership approach. But if anybody does have any questions about the process or requirements, we're a pretty friendly bunch. So please reach out to the Youth Pathways and Transitions team at the Department of Ed, and I might ask the team to send around some broad contact details for you all. But it's sort of a no wrong door approach, and we're very happy to have a chat.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. Well, thank you to all our presenters today, Liesl Egan, Katrina Moody, and Claire Sanders. To the audience, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the WIV newsletter to stay up to date with workplace laws and be notified of any future webinars. Before you leave, please complete our short survey. We greatly appreciate your feedback. If you have any further questions, contact our friendly advisory team at the contact details on the chat. You can submit an online inquiry and you can also give us a call. Thanks to everyone for taking the time to join us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Until then, stay safe, have a good week. Goodbye.